I once thought I had a perfect life. Until that day when I discovered my wife was having an affair with my best friend. The morning sun filtered through the bay windows of my office at Boston General, casting long shadows across the collection of awards and certificates that I'd accumulated over the years. At 45, I had reached a pinnacle. Most people only dream of standing before that wall of achievements. Adjusting my white coat, I could feel the weight of my reputation. My dark hair touched with the distinguished silver-framed features that had only sharpened with age. I had spent decades building this life with precision and dedication. What impossible surgery at a time. A soft knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. It was Mia, my assistant, with her usual calm efficiency. "Your 8 is prepped and waiting," she said. Exit board, balanced in her hand. "Thank you, Mia," I replied, checking my watch. Patek Philip, gifted by a grateful patient. Tell Drive, Reynolds. I'll scrub in now. The corridors were alive with the morning hum of the hospital. Nurses, second nurses, residents, other doctors nodded or smiled as I passed. Some with admiration, others with quiet respect. I had earned it. Every nod, every glance. Building a career like mine required more than just skill. It demanded sacrifice. In the scrub room, I was met by Oliver Grant, a man who had been both colleague and friend for over 2 decades. His usual jovial demeanor was subdued. "Zach," he began, his voice low. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" "Of course," I said, scrubbing in. Methodically. "Make it quick." This happened when I was in the first or second year of junior high school. I think I was about 13 years old. I grew up in the countryside. I've got a thoracic reconstruction. Waiting. He hesitated, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "It's about Lily." The mention of my wife's name gave me pause, but I kept my movements steady. "What about her?" "There are rumors," he said carefully, "about her and Drive. Nathaniel Street Ward." I laughed, the sound echoing off the tiled walls. "The Swiss importer. You getting paranoid? I've known you for 20 years, and you've always been a little too protective. I wouldn't bring this up if I wasn't certain." "Zach, was when I was in the first," he said, his face etched with concern. "You're the best surgeon I've ever known and good friend. I just think you should keep your eyes open." His words stayed with me though. I waved them off at the time. Lily and I had been married for 20 years. We had 3 incredible children together, each carving their own paths to success. She managed their lives with the same precision I brought to the operating room, organizing charity galas and overseeing our social obligations. When would she have the time for an affair? Still, as the day wore on, I found myself recalling small moments. Her sudden interest in European medical journals, the new wardrobe, the spot treatments Nathaniel had recommended. Was it possible? Could she be hiding something that evening? I arrived home earlier than usual, eager to dispel the doubts. The Carter mansion, nestled in Beacon Hill, was as elegant as ever inside. The children were scattered. Tiara and Noah on the living room sofa in their blazers from Phillips Academy, and Chloe upstairs, preparing for her debate tournament. Lily appeared radiant, as always, her phone in hand. She made a show of asking about my day, but her eyes darted to the screen. Every few seconds, I didn't press her instead. I watched. Small things stood out. Her deflection when the children asked about dinner plans. The way she checked her phone when she thought no one was looking later. As the house grew quiet, I found myself in my study, replaying Oliver's warning in my mind. I wanted to dismiss it, to trust the woman I had built my life with, but something wouldn't let me. It wasn't until the conference in Chicago weeks later that everything unraveled. The Chicago conference was the perfect excuse to step back from my life for a few days. It was a standard gathering of medical mind filled with dry presentations on emerging techniques and data I had already mastered. I should have been engaged, taking notes or networking, but my mind was elsewhere. Oliver's warning replayed in my head, now joined by a host of small observations that refused to be ignored. I checked my phone between sessions, looking for texts from Lily. They were there. Brief, pleasant updates about the kids and her busy schedule. Everything appeared normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. 20 years of marriage had sharpened my instincts when it came to her moods. And lately, something had been off after the last session. I decided to surprise the family with an early return. My last surgery of the week had been rescheduled, leaving me with an open window I didn't usually have. As I boarded the flight back to Boston, I found myself wondering if the unease gnawing at me was real, or if Oliver's concerns had planted a seed of paranoia. The house was quiet when I arrived, the usual hum of activity subdued. My footsteps were silent on the polished floors as I made my way toward my study. Drawn by the sound of low voices, I paused just outside the door, the familiar cadence of my son, Noah's voice filtering through the crack. "You're sure about the timing?" "Marsh," Noah asked, his tone uncharacteristically serious. Candace's voice followed, calm and calculated in a way I'd never heard before. "Trust me, darling. Once you and Lucas are settled at Princeton, everything will be set. The divorce papers are ready. Your father won't know what hit him." The words hit me like a blow, but I stayed rooted in place, forcing myself to listen. Why not just tell him? Now, Noah's question hung the air because his name still carries weight with college admissions. Lily replied smoothly. "Once that's secured, Nathaniel and I will move forward. Everything's already arranged. The accounts, the house. Mark and Dryan have been helping me plan this for years." Mark and Dryan, my lawyer and accountant. The realization burned. "But Nathaniel's been more of a father to you than Ethan ever was," Candace added. "The DNA test just confirmed what we already knew." I leaned against the wall, my mind racing. DNA test. My hands clenched into fists as the pieces fell into place. Lucas and Noah weren't mine. They'd never been mine. And she'd known. Had always known through the crack in the door. I saw her move to her laptop, initiating a video call. "Nathaniel." Reed's face filled the screen, his Swiss accent carrying a smugness that turned my stomach. "My loves," he said. "How goes the plan?" "Perfectly," Lily purred. "Ethan's conference runs through tomorrow, and he has another late surgery next week." Nathaniel chuckled. "They sound like nails on glass. Everything is already arranged. These Americans are so easy to manipulate. They actually believe I need their approval for every procedure." My breath hitched. Then I stepped back, silently, retreating down the hall. Years of surgical training had taught me to compartmentalize emotions in critical moments. Now, that skill saved me from storming into the room and confronting them. Both emotions were a liability. Precision and timing were everything. I spent the rest of the night gathering evidence. Candace's laptop had been left unattended. Her password, our anniversary date, almost laughably easy to guess. What I found confirmed everything. Years of emails between her and Nathaniel, detailing their affair and financial schemes. Correspondence with Mark and Jed outlined plans to strip me of assets once the divorce was finalized. And the DNA tests. Proof of Nathaniel's paternity were there, dated from when the twins were infants. It was all there, neatly organized, like a case file, waiting to be dissected by dawn. I had everything I needed. Copies of emails, financial statements, and DNA results were secured. New trusts were established, protecting what mattered most, the children's education. The funds were transferred into accounts they couldn't touch, and every loose end was tied. Years of meticulous planning had prepared me for this moment. Even if I hadn't known it on the kitchen table, I left my parting message, a neat pile of documents, detailed everything I had uncovered on top. My wedding ring set like a final punctuation mark. When I stepped out of the house that morning, the sun was just beginning to rise. I took one last look at the home I had built now, a monument to betrayal. As I drove away, the skyline of Boston faded in my rear-view mirror, along with the perfect life I had spent 20 years creating ahead. Lay something else, something better than perfection. It was the truth. By the time Candace found my note, I was miles away. The morning air smelled crisp and clean. As I drove west, the open road stretching before me, like an invitation, my Aston Martin purred beneath me. The sound almost meditative for the first time in decades. I felt something close to peace. I'd left the lies behind. Now it was time to rebuild on my terms. The first calls came in within hours. Lily predictably tried to reach me first. I let it go to voicemail. Then came texts. Angry. Pleading. Deflecting. I didn't bother reading them. She would know soon enough that I wasn't the same man who had walked into our marriage 20 years ago, blindly trusting her at every turn. Next was Mark. Hand. My lawyer or former lawyer. As of that morning. Ethan, we need to discuss this. His voicemail began. His usually smooth tone, tinged with panic. There's been a misunderstanding. I deleted it. There was no misunderstanding. Mark had betrayed me, and I had the receipts to prove it. Oliver had once told me that trust like tissue was fragile and irreplaceable when torn. Now I fully understood what he meant. Meanwhile, back in Boston, the carefully constructed facade of the Carter family began to crumble. Lily had always been adept at maintaining appearances, but even she couldn't hold back the tide. Word of my sudden departure spread quickly through our social circles. Carried on. The whispers of acquaintances and so-called friends. Candace's first move was damage control. She played the part of the abandoned wife, beautifully telling anyone who would listen that I had suffered a breakdown, that my demanding career had finally taken its toll. The Boston Globe even ran a sympathetic piece about Drive, Carter's shocking leave of absence. But the cracks in her story showed almost immediately. Oliver, loyal to the end, wasn't about to let her rewrite history. He leaked, just enough to the press, a few choice hints about Nathaniel's arrival at Boston General, coupled with questions about his credentials. By the end of the week, Nathaniel's name was being dragged through the mud alongside Lily at the hospital. Whispers turned into outright gossip. Nathaniel Swift's accent and flashy confidence, once seen as charming, now felt suspicious. Staff began to share stories of his less than professional behavior, glances that lingered too long, conversations cut short. When others approached the trail, led straight back to Lily for Lucas, Snow and Chloe. The fallout was even more personal. They had always been high achievers, the products of Candace's relentless focus on success. But now their accomplishments were overshadowed by the scandal. Classmates at Phillips Academy whispered behind their backs, and their friends' parents sent subtle but clear signals. The Carter name was no longer an asset. Lucas, ever pragmatic, tried to keep his focus on college applications, but even he couldn't know the tension at home. "Do you think Dad's coming back?" he asked Noah one night as they sat in their room. Noah shrugged, his usual confidence shaken. "If he does, it won't be for Mom." Chloe, the youngest, struggled the most at just 16. She lacked her brother's ability to compartmentalize. She turned to our debate team and schoolwork for solace. But the strain showed. I knew all of this because Oliver kept me informed. This happened when I was in the first or second year of junior high school. I think I was about 13 years old. I grew up in the countryside. I never acknowledged his updates directly. It was enough to know my children were weathering the storm. Candace's desperation grew as her resources dwindled. She stormed into Mark Hung's office one morning, demanding answers. "What do you mean? You can't access the house trust." She snapped her manicured nails, tapping angrily against the desk. Mark loosened his tie, his confidence cracking under her glare. "Ethan moved everything before you could file the papers. His grandfather's trust predates your marriage. It's untouchable. Then find another way." She aged, her voice rising. "I have appearances to maintain. Do you know what people are saying about us? Perhaps, if you and Nathaniel had been more discreet." Mark muttered, his tone biting. Candace's eyes narrowed. "Careful. Mark, remember who knows about your creative accounting. I remember who helped you plan this disaster." Mark shot back. "I'm not the one who underestimated Ethan. Their alliance, once so fractured under the weight of their own scheming. Nathaniel fared no better. His carefully cultivated image as a respected surgeon unraveled almost overnight. Lorraine Street ward. His estranged wife took matters into her own hands. She convened an emergency meeting of Boston General's board, armed with damning evidence of Nathaniel's misdeeds. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lorraine began, her British accent slicing through the murmurs, "I regret to inform you that my husband's credentials are not what they seem." Nathaniel, seated at the far end of the room, hailed Lorraine. "This isn't the place." "No, Nathaniel," she interrupted, her smile razor sharp. "This is exactly the place. These people deserve to know the truth." She distributed a folder to each board member detailing cases of malpractice, falsified research, the most damning of all, a pattern of affairs with patients. Wise. The evidence was airtight, and Nathaniel's protests fell on deaf ears by the end of the meeting. His privileges were suspended pending investigation. Security escorted him from the premises. His humiliation complete. As I settled into my new life, I watched from afar as their plans unraveled. The foundation they had built on lies and betrayal was crumbling beneath them, and there was a certain poetic justice in watching them scramble to salvage what they could. They had underestimated me, believing my focus on work made me blind to their schemes. What they failed to realize was that precision and timing weren't just skills for the operating room. They were tools for life. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my future. And as I drove through the mountains, the rising sun painting the sky in shades of gold, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in years. The truth was out, and it was only the beginning. Boston society had always been an intricate web of connections and alliances, but the fallout from Candace's betrayal exposed how fragile that web truly was. Her social circle, once as loyal as it was exclusive, began to distance themselves. Charity boards sent polite but firm emails requesting her resignation. Club memberships quietly call APS, said even the parents' committee at Phillips Academy, where Lucas and Noah had thrived, began excluding her from meetings and events. Lily, this happened when I was in the first or second year of junior high school. I think I was about 13 years old. I grew up in the countryside. Her poise was unraveling. Her carefully cultivated life built on appearances, wealth and strategic relationships was falling apart. And Nathaniel, he wasn't there to pick up the pieces. His own life had spiraled into chaos, leaving Candace to face the consequences alone. I learned most of this secondhand through Oliver's updates. He had been a steadfast friend throughout, carefully feeding me information without pushing for a response. He knew I didn't need the details to feel vindicated, but I appreciated the clarity they provided. One particular morning, his text read, "They're trying to contest the trusts. Your lawyer shut it down in record time." Mark folded like a cheap deck chair. I smiled at the image. Mark, hands down. All had been inevitable. The man had built his career on navigating legal gray areas, but he wasn't prepared for the storm. I unleashed my new attorney. Jonathan Drake was a Harvard classmate and a specialist in high-stakes litigation. He dismantled Mark's arguments with surgical precision, leaving no room for appeal. Nathaniel's troubles were equally poetic. Lorraine, his estranged wife, wasn't content with exposing his malpractice. She went further, uncovering financial fraud in his Swiss dealings that made headlines across Europe. By the time Swiss authorities got involved, Nathaniel's accounts were frozen and his assets were seized back in Boston. His name became a cautionary tale. The once revered surgeon who had charmed his way into Boston General was now the subject of tabloid headlines and investigative reports. The hospital, desperate to distance itself from the scandal, erased any trace of him from their website and internal directories. Meanwhile, Lorraine took a seat on the hospital's ethics committee. Her steely determination to reform the institution made her a force to be reckoned with. Oliver, who had taken over as chairman of the board, often joked that Lorraine's presence ensured no one would ever dare pull her. Nathaniel again. Lucas and Noah, despite their mother's best efforts to shield them, couldn't escape the fallout. The twins had always been resilient, but the constant whispers at school and the media coverage took their toll. I knew they felt caught between loyalty to their mother and the weight of the truth. One afternoon, Oliver sent me a picture of them at a lacrosse game. They looked strong, determined, but the smiles didn't reach their eyes. It hurt to see them like that. But I reminded myself that they were growing through this, becoming stronger than the circumstances that surrounded them. Chloe, on the other hand, began to show a quiet independence. While her brothers worked through their frustrations, she channeled her energy into debate and academics. Oliver mentioned that she had been asking questions about financial aid and independent student status, a clear sign that she was preparing for a future where she didn't rely on anyone but herself. Back at my new practice in Aspen, life was simpler. The mountains framed every view, their stillness, a sharp contrast to the chaos side left behind. My patients valued privacy as much as excellence, and I found a renewed sense of purpose in my work. Every now and then, I'd receive updates from my children. Lucas's acceptance to Princeton came first, followed shortly by Noah's. Chloe, though still in high school, was already making waves in her debate circuit. They were thriving, even as the dust settled around them. Lily, however, was not. The stress of the scandal combined with her dwindling resources began to take a visible toll. Oliver described her appearance at a recent charity event as ghostly. Her once radiant beauty dimmed. It wasn't long before her health began to deteriorate, a reality that none of her scheming had prepared her for one day. I received an unexpected call from Chloe. Her voice trembled as she told me about Candace's diagnosis stage for pancreatic cancer. She didn't want me to call you, Chloe admitted, but I didn't know who else to turn to for a moment. I said nothing. The woman who had betrayed me, who had plotted to destroy everything I had built, was now facing the inevitable. I thought of all the ways she had hurt me, the lies she had spun, the lives she had upended. And yet, when I thought of my children, our children, regardless of DNA, I knew what I had to do. I'll make the arrangements, I told Chloe. Check. Get the best care available within days. Lily was admitted to a private oncology suite at MD Anderson, one of the top cancer centers in the country. I assured her treatment was covered. This happened when I was in the first or second year of junior high school. I think I was about 13 years old. I grew up in the countryside. I remained anonymous in the process for the children. This was not about revenge. It was about mercy and closure, about giving them the chance to make peace with their mother, while they still could. Lucas, Noah, and Chloe visited her daily, their loyalty to her unwavering, despite everything they saw her. Through the treatments, through the pain, and eventually through her final days, she passed quietly surrounded by the children she had once fought so hard to control. Nathaniel's response was as cold as expected. A curt email, expressing his deepest sympathies, arrived hours after her death, along with a flimsy excuse about why he couldn't attend any memorial services. It was the final betrayal in a lifetime of betrayals. Candace's death marked the end of one chapter, and the beginning of another. For me, it was a chance to let go of the anger I had carried, to focus on the life I was building and the people who mattered most. The truth had revealed itself. And now, justice was doing its work. As I looked out over the snow-capped mountains from my office, I felt a sense of peace. Candace and Nathaniel had tried to destroy me, but they had failed. Instead, they had freed me to rebuild, to heal, and to prove that real strength wasn't in revenge, but in resilience. Candace's passing brought a strange quiet to the chaos that had consumed the last year. The public spectacle of her betrayal and Nathaniel's disgrace gave way to something more personal: grief, reflection, and for my children, the complicated process of moving forward. I hadn't seen them in person since I'd left Boston, but I had stayed close in my own way. I funded their education, forwarded guidance through trusted channels, and quietly ensured their futures were secure. When Chloe called to inform me about her mother's death, I knew it was time to close the distance. The funeral was a small affair. Despite Lily's former prominence in Boston society, few of her old friends attended. Their absences spoke volumes, a testament to how shallow those relationships had always been. The ones who did come were more curious than mournful, casting furtive glances at the children and whispering about the scandal. I stood at a distance, watching Lucas, Noah and Chloe as they greeted the sparse crowd. They carried themselves with a quiet dignity that filled me with pride. They were young, but strong. Already, learning how to weather storms that would break most people. When the service ended, the children found me waiting by the car. Lucas was the first to approach, his expression a mix of surprise and relief. "You came here?" he said, his voice steadier than I expected. "Of course," I replied for you. Noah stood beside him, his jaw tight as though holding back a tide of emotion. "She would have hated seeing you here," he said. Bluntly. "Probably," I admitted. "But this isn't about her. It's about you three." Chloe, who had always been the most perceptive of the three, stepped forward. "She never stopped talking about you. In the end," she said, "you were always 2 steps ahead, and it drove her crazy." I gave her a small smile. It wasn't a competition, but I'm glad I could help when it mattered. That day marked the first step in rebuilding our relationship over the following weeks. I made time to visit each of them individually, reconnecting in ways I hadn't before. Lucas was thriving at Princeton, fully immersed in his permed coursework. When we met in his dorm room, he couldn't stop talking about his internship at the university hospital. "Did you know the chief surgeon there?" he asked. "He said he trained under you and that you were the best he'd ever worked with." I nodded. "Drive. Houghton, he has a sharp mind and steady hands. You'll learn a lot from him." Lucas hesitated before asking the question I could see had been on his mind. "The internship. I mean, the reference. Was it? You were in that spot?" I said. "I just made sure the right people noticed." He smiled, relief and gratitude evident. "Thanks, Dad." Noah's life had taken a different path. He was deep into his genetics research, splitting his time between labs and conferences. We met on a hiking trail in Aspen, where the crisp mountain air gave us the space to talk openly. "I always thought biology defined everything," he said as we paused to take in the view. "But I've been thinking a lot about what makes a family. It's not DNA, is it?" I shook my head. "DNA is a starting point, not a conclusion. Family is built on choices. I chose you three every day for 20 years, and I still choose you." Now, Noah's expression softened. "You know, a lot of my research is inspired by us proving that nurture can override nature. I'm proud of you," I said, "not because of your work, but because of who you've become." Chloe, now in her second year here at Yale, had grown into a poised and self-assured young woman. We met for dinner at a quiet restaurant near campus, where she shared her latest accomplishments with a mix of excitement and humility. "The college counselor who helped me with my applications," she said, looking at me knowingly. "That was you, wasn't it?" I smiled. "You needed guidance, not interference. There's a difference." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Mom never understood that. She always wanted control. And Nathaniel, he just wanted trophies. Neither of them saw what really mattered." I said, "But you did, and that's why you're here." While my children moved forward, Nathaniel's downfall continued in earnest. The Swiss authorities were relentless in their pursuit of his financial crimes. His assets were liquidated to cover restitution, and his medical license was permanently revoked. I heard about his sentencing through a news alert: 10 years in prison, complete asset forfeiture, and a lifetime ban from practicing medicine. I thought about the smugness he once displayed, the way he had underestimated me at every turn. Now he was a cautionary tale, a man whose ambition and arrogance had been his undoing. Lily, too, became a footnote in Boston society. Her estate, riddled with debts and legal entanglements, was dismantled to settle outstanding claims. The children's trust funds, untouched and protected, were the only part of her legacy that endured in Aspen. My life flourished. My private practice had grown into a network of clinics known for combining surgical excellence with ethical care. I received messages from former colleagues and patients, many of them seeking treatment or advice. But my greatest satisfaction came from the quiet moments with my children, who visited often at one such dinner. Lucas announced his plans for medical school, while Noah shared that his genetics research had made the Nobel shortlist. Chloe, meanwhile, had just been offered a partnership at one of the country's most prestigious law firms. "You chose us when it mattered," she said, raising her glass, "and we wouldn't be here without you." I looked at each of them. My pride, immeasurable. Candace and Nathaniel had tried to destroy me, believing that wealth and status were my greatest assets. But they never understood the truth. My greatest achievement was the family I had built through love, resilience, and unwavering support. Years passed, and the echoes of betrayal became distant memories, replaced by a life built on strength and resilience. The Carter family, once fractured by lies, had come together again. Not perfectly, but honestly. In the end, that was what mattered. Nathaniel Reed's fall was complete, from the polished halls of Boston General to the sterile confines of a Swiss prison. His decline had been a spectacle for the world to see. His crimes were laid bare: financial fraud, malpractice, and the ruin of multiple lives, including his own. The final blow came when Lorraine, his wife, uncovered evidence of his embezzlement from patient accounts. That revelation ensured Nathaniel would never regain his freedom or his reputation. The Geneva Tribune's headline summed it up perfectly. "Once revered surgeon faces 10 years for fraud and betrayal from my office in Aspen." I read the article with a detached sense of closure. Nathaniel had always believed he was untouchable, but his choices had caught with him, as they always do. Back in Boston, the aftermath of Candace's schemes continued to unfold. Her estate, burdened by debts and lawsuits, was dismantled piece by piece. The remaining assets were redirected to restitution for those she and Nathaniel had wronged. My children's trust funds, untouchable by any legal challenge, remained intact, a testament to the foresight and planning that had protected them from her greed. Mark, Hand, and Ryan Hickman, once integral to Candace's plans, faced their own reckoning. Mark's law license was revoked after his complicity in the scheme was exposed. Stripped of his Boston practice, he now managed a small office, handling minor traffic cases in Providence. Ryan, similarly disgraced, lost his CPA license and found himself teaching basic accounting at a community college, a far cry from the high-powered clientele he once courted. Their fates served as quiet reminders that justice, like surgery, often required precision and patience for my children. Life moved forward with purpose and promise. Lucas, now a chief resident at Massachusetts General, carried himself with the confidence of a man who had found his calling. His groundbreaking research in surgical techniques had already earned him recognition in medical journals, building on a legacy I had once started. Noah's path was equally impressive. His genetics research had revolutionized the field, earning him a Nobel Prize nomination. The same work that had started as a quest to understand his own identity had become a beacon for others seeking to define what family truly meant. Chloe, ever determined, had blazed her own trail in the legal world. At 26, she became the youngest partner at a prestigious law firm. Her expertise in trust law reform, already influencing policy at the national level. Her Yale Law Review articles were now required reading in ethics courses. We celebrated their successes together, often gathering at my Aspen estate, a far cry from the formal dinners of their childhood. These moments, filled with laughter and warmth, were the true legacy I had worked so hard to protect. One Sunday dinner, Noah passed his phone around the table. The headline read, "Swiss surgeon's new wife files for divorce aid. Financial scandal." Lucas snorted, consistent to the end. At least he's staying true to his nature. Chloe raised an eyebrow, HEK blaming his latest wife for his failures. "Now isn't he?" "Of course he is," Lucas replied. "That's what people like him do." I smiled, but stayed quiet, letting them process the news in their own way. For me, Nathaniel and Lily were ghosts of a life I no longer lived. My focus was on the present, the family I had chosen, and the legacy we were creating together in the years that followed. My practice expanded beyond Aspen. The Carter Medical Group became synonymous with ethical excellence, attracting patients and surgeons from around the world. Clinics in Dubai and London carried the same values I had built my career on: precision, compassion, and integrity at our 20th anniversary. Gayla, a journalist, asked me about my success. What's been the key to building something so lasting? She asked. I thought, for a moment before answering, success isn't about what others take from you. It's about what you choose to build after the loss. The quote made headlines the next day. But for me, it was simply the truth in Geneva's prison. In library, Nathaniel sat at a wooden desk, a stack of books before him. Among them was a medical ethics case study that featured the Carter family. His name appeared in footnotes, a cautionary tale of hubris and deceit. The irony wasn't lost on him. Forced to read about the legacy he had tried to destroy, Nathaniel was confronted with the stark reality of his choices. Each page reminded him of what could have been the empire. He might have shared the sons. He might have known the life he might have led. But life wasn't about might have beens. It was about choices. And Nathaniel's choices had left him alone. A man with nothing but regrets in Boston. Candace's grave remained largely unvisited, except by the children who had long since come to terms with her flaws. They honored her memory, quietly, acknowledging her role in their lives, while rejecting the choices that had led to her downfall. Chloe, ever eloquent, summed it up best during one visit. She was our mother, and we loved her, but we don't have to love what she did. Lucas and Noah nodded in agreement, their shared silence speaking volumes at our regular Sunday dinners in Aspen. 3 generations gathered around my table. Lucas's wife, a brilliant pediatric surgeon, discussed cases with me, while their daughter colored medical dimes at the table. Noah, now a Nobel laureate, debated genetics with his husband. Chloe, poised as ever, shared stories of her latest court victories with her fiancé, the federal prosecutor. Did you see the latest about Nathaniel? Noah asked one evening, holding up his phone. He's giving interviews now, playing the victim. Some people never learn. Lucas replied, but Dad always said it. Best character reveals itself through choices. They finished the line in unison, and everyone faces the consequences of theirs. Looking around the table, I felt a deep sense of pride. Candace and Nathaniel had tried to destroy me, believing that wealth and status were my greatest achievements. But they had been wrong. My true legacy was sitting before me. A family built on love, resilience, and integrity. As the sun set behind the mountains, I raised my glass to the people who mattered most to choices. I said, my children echoed the toast, their voices strong and certain. In the end, the truth had revealed itself, not just about Lily and Nathaniel, but about the strength of what we had built together. And that truth made all the difference. Here's the next story. I told him. I was no longer attracted to him. While I was inebriated. When I awoke, this occurred. If I could go back in time and slap myself, I would just think, for a second, my name is Emily. I am 30 years old. And my husband, Luke, is 35 years old. We have been together for 3 years. I don't know where to begin with this. So perhaps all I can do is let it out. Let me warn you right away that this is not one of those movies where everything improves in the end, as if everything had a silver lining. It is ugly, shameful, and entirely my fault. First and foremost, I want to express my love for my hubby. I thought I did. Luke is one of the kindest and most hardworking persons I've ever met. He owns his own modest business, and while he isn't flashy, he's dependable. The type of guy who recalls your favorite coffee order without asking, and stays up late to assist you with tasks you didn't even realize you needed help with. But I'm not here to brag about him. Actually, I'm here because I ruined everything. All of it all began last Friday. My night out occurred in the evening after work, and I considered it a girl's night out. There was wine, beer, spirits, and pretty much everything being served. And to be honest, I was a touch tipsy. By the time I arrived home, I was on a high from both drink, and I'm not sure, bitterness, insecurity. Who knows what happens in your head in 5 minutes? Luke was waiting for me. When I arrived home, he'd stayed up late to make sure I arrived home safely. So what did I do? Instead of thanking him, I looked him in the eyes and stated, I'm no longer attracted to you. Yeah, I know the type of person who says it to their husband. What is the worst part? I had no idea I uttered it in the first place. That morning I awoke with fuzzy vision and indistinct thoughts, feeling as if my brain was about to explode. And Luke was perched on the side of the bed, staring at the carpet, as if his heart had been ripped out. These were his first words to me. "This is your genuine opinion of me." And that is, when everything came apart, you might say. Luke and I met approximately 4 years ago at a little cafe downtown town, where he worked as the manager. I still recall the first time I saw him. He was standing behind the counter, wearing a basic button-up shirt, and a worn smile that indicated he'd had a long day. I wouldn't say it was love at first sight. It was nothing like that. He was not my type at all. I mean, he was cute, but not in the tall, charming way that normally drew me in. Luke was unusual, quiet, steady, and frankly, a little ordinary. I didn't pay him any attention at first. We exchanged some words when I came in for lunch one day. He noticed that I had left the napkins behind, and instead of delivering them to me, he cracked this little joke about how I was either saving the world or something. It wasn't hilarious, but it made me laugh. Good. Of course. I suppose that is where it all started at the time. I was not searching for a relationship. I recently ended a complicated relationship with a guy who, in retrospect, was all appearances and no substance. My friends were often teasing me about my awful taste in men, and one of them even suggested, "Emily, maybe it's time to quit looking for showy guys and find someone who genuinely treats you." Well, I suppose Luke meets the bill. He wasn't flamboyant or overconfident, but he had a way of making you feel secure. Several weeks passed and we both stopped by the cafe on occasion to get coffee, and he invited Ed and me out. Once, that is correct. I remember thinking, for a moment before answering yes, even though I wasn't sure if I was physically attracted to him. I asked myself, why not? I was tired of looking for men who are infatuated with me, but have no regard for me as a person. And Luke, he cared. It became evident very quickly. We'd been dating for approximately 1.5 years when he proposed. It wasn't particularly grand. No extravagant romantic gestures or lavish dinners. He just took me to our favorite park. One afternoon, we took out a ring and stated, "You are my best friend. I can't imagine living without you. Will you marry me?" It wasn't the type of proposal you'd see in a movie, but it seemed natural. So, I said, "Sure." The first year of our marriage went well. Great. Even Luke met all of my expectations for a boyfriend. He was a fantastic buddy. Dependable, pleasant, and always made time for me. Despite his tight schedule, I had never felt more cherished. Nonetheless, sometime along this process, the slideshow began. I'm not sure precisely when it started, but small cracks began to appear. It wasn't like we were always fighting or something. It was subtler than that. I began to notice things I hadn't previously, such as how his shirts didn't fit properly, or how he never seemed to be interested in working out. I told myself it didn't matter, but a part of me wondered whether I had settled too early. Looking back, I'm not sure when it happened, but at some point, I began to observe Luke differently. It wasn't as if he suddenly changed into a completely new person, or did something improper that I would find offensive. He remained the good-natured man I desired, but something inside of me altered. Perhaps it was the several brunches I've shared with my buddies. This is similar to, "Have you seen how much weight I bench pressed today?" Or maybe took me on a weekend excursion without asking, "Check out how healthy he is in this photo." Then they turned to me, and I felt a sinking sensation in the pit of my stomach. Don't get me wrong, Luke was wonderful, in many ways, but in those moments, all I could think about was how we didn't fit the picture. Perfect. Ideal. I envisioned. I cruised through Instagram, seeing couples happy at the gym or on exotic holidays. Then I browsed through the few photos I have with Luke. He was not photogenic. He constantly appeared rigid, and his clothes never seemed to fit properly. It wasn't fair, but I began wishing he looked otherwise taller, thinner, more something. Instead of despising him, I came to loathe him for things he never promised to bring into our relationship. Admittedly, I am embarrassed by this, but I began to find trivial, insignificant issues to argue about. For example, if he was wearing a shirt to tie over his tummy, I'd warn him that shirt might be too tight, sweetheart. Or if he returned for more at the table, I'd laugh. Well, was in the first hike? You're making up for it tonight. I thought I was brilliant now. I see that those simple statements probably affected you more than I realized. Luke sensed his shift. Of course, he wasn't unaware. He'd ask, "Is everything okay with us? You've been quite silent recently." I would always brush it off. I am merely weary or work has been stressful. The fact is that I didn't know how to describe my feelings, because they didn't make sense to me. I loved Luke or believed I did, but in my imagination, I was creating a version of him that did not exist. And every time he fell short of the idealized level, I became more frustrated. Things began to snowball. I became overly focused on all of his movements, as if I had developed a paranoid attitude toward him. If a man has spent so much time sitting on the couch, I wonder why he does not exercise. If he told me what occurred at work, I'd ignore it just as quickly. It was too dull and uninteresting for television. That was ridiculous. I realize this now. But at the time, I couldn't stop myself. I was comparing him to males. From my imagination. Folks I had likely never met in real life. It didn't help that my buddies were open about their thoughts. My friend Jenna once grabbed me aside after brunch and told me, "Emily, you're beautiful. You could have ended up with anyone. But you chose Luke not to be disrespectful. But don't ever think you've settled." I shrugged it off, but her comment stayed with me. Have I reached an agreement? Was I pushing too hard to convince myself that Luke was sufficient? Luke wasn't perfect, but he didn't deserve the way I treated him. I began creating a relational space between us without consciously deciding to do so. I'd sit around with friends or just spend time on social media, liking photographs of happy couples. And while we obviously aren't, if Luke ever tried to set up a date night, I'd come up with excuses to say sleepy or possibly next week. No, it wasn't the geographic location that became important. I started emotionally distancing myself. One night, he questioned me directly. "Do you still love me?" I froze. I wanted to say yes, but the words stayed in my throat instead. I muttered something imprecise. Like, of course. I do. Why would you ask that? He didn't push, but the expression on his face told me he wasn't persuaded. It was Luke's thing. He never pressed. He remained calm, patient and understanding. But rather than enjoying it, I began to perceive it as a weakness. I wanted him to fight for me and demand answers. But he didn't. He simply let me draw away in my sick mind. I also blamed him for that. I'm not sure how I came up with such emotions. Perhaps I'll self-actualize him. Perhaps I was striving to damage the best thing I'd ever had, because I felt I didn't deserve it. That's all I know. The more I tried to keep us out of each other's lives, the more Luke struggled to let go. And the more he claimed, the more I wanted to flee. That night began as any other girl's night. My pals and I had planned to meet in a downtown bar to catch up and relax. Following a tough week, it wasn't supposed to be a big deal. Just a drink or two, maybe some laughs, and then home by midnight. But somewhere along the way, one drink became 3, and then 4, and before I knew it, I had entirely forgotten how much I had. The music was loud, the conversations were flowing, and all I could think of was how great it felt to be free of my worries for a change. What I hadn't realized was that it was a total disaster. By the time I came home that night, after midnight, I couldn't stand, let alone think clearly. Luke was still awake when I drunkenly made my way inside. As he always did, he had to wait till I arrived home, safely. That is the type of person. He's very reliable. And instead of either thanking him or politely reacting to the gentleman, I did something much worse. I don't recall precisely what happened, but I know I was slurring my words and my emotions were boiling over in a way that only happened after you've had too many drinks at point. I glanced at him and stated, "You are no longer attractive to me." Just like that. No context. No explanation. Only those nasty piercing words. All I can remember is waking up the next morning with a severe headache. And the same sense of regret in my mouth. Initially, I didn't see anything odd with her. I thought it was just another hangover. Another weekday. Another day's end. However, my physical strength increased sharply. And unexpectedly. Particularly when I entered the kitchen to uncover Luke's genuine attitude. He was not in his usual upbeat mood. No good morning. There was no preparation of coffee. He just sat there, silent and frigid. And I wondered if we hadn't met before or if we had. And he could end the relationship. He rarely spoke to me. And when he did, it was brief and abrupt. I asked him if there was something wrong. And he just looked at me, like I was a stranger. That's when it began to sink in. Something happened. Something nasty. It wasn't until the end of the day that I summoned the guts to ask him directly whether he could repeat what I was saying. He did not yell or become agitated. That is not who Luke is. All he could do was look at me with horrified eyes, as if I had just struck him, and say, "Do you really think that about me? What have you got to tell me that you are interested in me?" I felt as if the air had been taken from the room. My initial reaction was to refute it, to tell him it wasn't real. But how could I couldn't even remember saying it? And the fact that those statements came out of my mouth, intoxicated or not, implied that they were true. Right. I attempted to explain that it was simply the alcohol talking. But Luke didn't believe me. And really, I couldn't blame him. I froze when Luke inquired if I really meant it about him, if I wasn't sexually drawn to him. He just sat there, astonished, and I had no idea what to say or how to make amends for what I had just said after what seemed like an age. I muttered an apology, claiming it was only the whiskey talking. I did not mean it, but I said it, and even as I said it, I realized how weak it was. Luke did not yell or quarrel. That almost made things worse. He only nodded slightly, as if he was contemplating what I said, then responded, "I need some time to think." He then walked away, leaving me standing in the kitchen with a pit in my stomach that was Luke calm and poised, even though he was obviously hurt. And instead of making me feel better, it actually made me feel worse. The following several days were weird. That would be the most accurate way to characterize it. At this point, I looked at him and mentioned it again. But things were different. He was simply cutting me off and creating a barrier between us as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Overnight, he started going to work early and returning late at night, claiming that he had a lot of business to manage at home. He confined his communication with me to that, which was absolutely necessary. I used to treasure the little things like him asking how my day went, or worse, recalling some minor detail he had noticed at work. He seemed to be physically present, yet emotionally absent. He stopped asking me about my day. Please stop laughing at my jokes. He was not rude nor harsh, yet his quiet was deafening. Every glance seemed colder. Each reaction becomes more distant. It's difficult to describe, but it was like living with the ghosts of the person I had married. The shame began to sink in every time I looked at him, and it eventually consumed me little by little. He had gone beyond what I had stated and spoken that night alone. It was about everything. How I'd allowed animosity to build up the small jabs at his appearance. The emotional distance Sid constructed long before everything happened. And now I was paying the price. I attempted to repair problems. Despite my lack of culinary skills, I prepared his favorite dishes. I placed little notes in his lunch bag, as I used to when we first got married one night. I even attempted to start intimacy in the hope that it might bridge the distance between us. But every time he simply gave me this sad one expression, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. And then he'd say, "I am not in the mood," or perhaps another time. It hurt, but I can't blame him. I had begun this catastrophe. Everyone, especially those observing from behind the scenes, noticed the stress. Actually, my pals saw it practically immediately. Or at least the more perceptive ones did during one of the breakfasts. Jonah turned to me and inquired, "Is everything okay between you and Luke? You appear strange." I alluded to it as a phase, and he just inquired if we were breaking up. but the look on her face did not appear to believe it. After a few days of frustration, I eventually told her about it. If it is the most appropriate way to describe her, I told her about the time I got drunk, the words I spoke to her, and the events that transpired that night. Jenna did not sugarcoat it. "Emily, you should have been more careful," she added quietly, so the other girls couldn't hear. "You know, Luke is a sensitive guy. Stuff like that, especially from you, stays with him. You have to repair this before it's too late." I nodded, but her comments simply increased the weight on my chest. I knew she was correct. But how can you fix something when the other person has already started backing away? The silence was the worst part. He did not yell at me, quarrel, or say anything that could be interpreted as an accusation against me. He merely existed, and it stung harder than if he had exploded. It was as if we had reached a quiet agreement that I wasn't worth turning his head. For that realization devastated me. I started overthinking everything I did. Whether I laughed at a TV show we were watching, I'd look at him to see whether he was upset. If I questioned him about his day and received a one-word response, I would wonder if I was pushing too hard. It seemed like I was walking on eggshells in my own home, constantly trying to prove to him, and possibly to myself, that I was still the girl he had fallen in love with one night. I tried to restart the talk, expecting that we could finally clear the air. "Luke," I started off carefully, "the other night, I'm deeply sorry, Before I could finish, he cut me off. "Emily, I have heard your apologies. I only need time." "Okay." His tone was not harsh, but it was definitive. I nodded and let it go. But inside I felt like I was losing him more with each passing day. I reminded myself that I just needed to be patient, that he would finally come around. But deep inside, I wasn't sure. Something had changed between us. I wasn't sure it could ever be the same again. It was Friday night and I couldn't take the solitude anymore. Luke hadn't talked to me in a week, and when he did, every word felt forced. The house felt suffocating. I was aware that I was to blame for everything, but I had no idea how to remedy it. So instead of staying at home and dealing with the mess I had created, I chose to go out. I told myself I only needed a break at night to clear my mind. But deep down, I knew I was running away. I texted Jenna to meet me at the pub, but she already made plans with her husband. Figures. Right. Everyone else seemed to have it together. Except me. I went alone, convincing myself it was no big thing. Only a drink or two, and then I'd go back home. But when I arrived there, loneliness hit me like a brick wall. Couples laughed, and groups of friends clinked drinks. It all made me feel so small. I ordered a drink, did another, hoping to drown out the guilt that was eating away at me. That's when he arrived. I didn't notice him at first, but he slid into the bar stool next to me and commented, "You look like you've had a long day." He had this effortless smile that made you feel like the only one in the room. He wasn't particularly attractive, but he carried himself confidently. I could not help but smile back. We started conversing, and it was so natural. He inquired about my profession, laughed at my idiotic jokes, and said I had the most beautiful he'd seen all night. It was such a sharp contrast to the frigid solitude I'd been experiencing at home. I knew I shouldn't have entertained it, but for the first time in weeks, I felt noticed. As the night progressed, the drinks kept coming, and the distinction between casual chat and something more began to blur. He wasn't forceful or overbearing, but rather pleasant in a way that made me feel wanted at one point. He pushed in closer and asked if I wanted to go outside. "It's getting loud in here." I paused, but then nodded. I convinced myself it was harmless. We were just going to talk outside. The crisp night air hit me like a wake-up call, but it was insufficient to prevent what happened next. We stood outside, his car talking and joking, and he mentioned that he couldn't believe someone like me was out alone. I have no idea what came over me, but before I knew it, I was leaning in, as was he. Then we kissed. It was not a passionate movie-worthy kiss. It was clumsy, spurred by a combination of drink and poor choices. But in that moment, it felt like everything I'd been looking for. Attention, approval, and relief from the weight of my guilt. It seemed wrong yet. I did not stop. The sound of a car approaching broke the trance. I backed away, laughed awkwardly, and turned to see who it was. And there he was, Luke, the countryside. He was sitting in his car, watching us. My heart fell. He did not go out, yell, or do anything theatrical. He just sat there, dejected, and almost disgusted. I will never forget how he looked at me, as if I were someone he didn't know. The guy I'd been speaking with noticed my reaction and followed my eyes. "Do you know him?" he inquired, glancing between Luke and me. I stammered, "That is my spouse." His face sank instantaneously. He stepped back and murmured, "I did not know you were married." I would not have, but I stopped listening. My emphasis was on Luke. I started walking towards his car, panicking. "Luke, please wait," I called out, but he didn't say anything. He simply rolled up his window and drove away, leaving me standing in the middle of the parking lot, like an idiot. The bartender tried to apologize again, but I waved him off. "Just go," I said, barely keeping it together. He didn't protest and swiftly retreated back into the pub. I was alone. My heart was racing and my mind was racing with all the mistakes I'd made. I couldn't believe what he'd just accomplished. I got into my car and tried calling Luke, but he did not respond. I must have contacted him 5 or 6 times without receiving a response. When I got home, his car wasn't in the driveway. The house was dark and his keys were missing. That's when it struck me. I might have just shattered his last piece of faith in me, and this time I wasn't sure I could fix it. The next morning, I felt like I had been hit by a vehicle. My head was throbbing, my stomach was in knots, and the events of the previous night were replaying in my memory. I didn't get much sleep after what happened. I kept expecting Luke would come home, that he'd calm down, and we could talk things out, but he never did. I came into the kitchen and there he was sitting at the table, with his arms crossed. He looked like he hadn't slept yet. His expression was too peaceful. That was Luke's thing. He didn't erupt or yell. When he was upset, he just became quiet. And if there's one thing I've discovered, it's that quiet can be far worse. Before I could say anything, he looked up and said, "We need to talk." His voice was steady, but his words felt like a strike in the gut. I sat across from him, my hands quivering, trying to find the perfect words to say. But before I could say anything, he started, "Last night, you made it apparent that you do not respect me or our marriage." He spoke in a chilly, controlled tone. "Emily, you've been pulling away from us. I've tried to ignore it. I'm hoping we can figure it out. But what I witnessed last night..." He stopped, his jaw tensing. That was the last straw. I felt my throat tighten. "Luke, it was not as it seemed. I swear I did not intend for any of that to happen." My voice trembled and I could feel tears welling up. "I just don't." He shut me off. He raises his hand. "Do not make excuses. You have kissed another man. Emily, you chose to do that, even if you hadn't intended for it to happen. It did, and I can't recover from that." I broke down under the weight of everything crashing down on me. "I'm so sorry," I sobbed. "I botched up. I know I did. But I adore you. Luke, please just let me to make things right." He shook his head, and for the first time, I noticed his eyes glisten. He didn't shed a single tear. "I gave you everything I had, but it wasn't enough. I'm not even sure who you are anymore. I hope you found what you were looking for, but it will not be with me." Those remarks hit the hardest. He could have yelled at me. I wanted to argue and plead with him, but I could see it in his face. He was finished. This wasn't simply about rage or hurt. This was final. He stood up and approached the door. "I'll collect my belongings and go by the end of the week," he continued, his tone firm but distant. "I will have my lawyer contact you regarding the separation." "Luke, please," I begged and followed him to the door. "Not do this. I'll do whatever it takes to fix it. Please advise me what to do." He turned to look at me one final time. his expression blank. "Emily, you cannot cure this. You broke it, and I am not remaining to pick up the pieces." Then, he was gone. The days that followed were among the worst of my life. True to his word, Luke packed his belongings and moved out at the end of the week. He did not argue or fight. He didn't ask for anything but his clothes and a few personal belongings. The house felt empty without him, and I spent the majority of my time crying, rehearsing every mistake I'd made in my mind. When his lawyer contacted him regarding the split, it felt like the last nail in the coffin. Luke wasn't dragging things out or allowing for reconciliation. He was cutting ties plain and simple. I signed the papers in a trance, not comprehending what was occurring. I tried contacting him several times after he moved out, hoping he'd at least agree to chat. But every phone went directly to voicemail, and every text went unanswered. It was as if I had become a stranger to him, someone he desired no connection with. And really, I couldn't blame him. I had degraded him, our marriage, and everything we had accomplished together. I believed I was attempting to reconcile us, but all I did was drag him away. And now, I was alone staring at the remains of a life I had wrecked with my own hands. Update. It's been a little more than 6 months since Luke left my life, and I honestly don't go a day without thinking about how badly I fouled things up. He has moved on now, and according to what I've heard, he's doing better than ever. He's dating someone new, who is not only very beautiful, but also appears to make him happy. I caught a peek of her by chance when I ran into them in the grocery store. She was giggling at something, he said. So he glanced free as if a weight had been removed off his shoulders. He's thriving, starting a new business, and from what I've heard, she treats him like a king. Meanwhile, I'm in a studio apartment, wondering how I let it all go. The apartment is small and dismal. To be honest, my parents assisted me in moving in, following our breakup, although they appeared more disappointed than helpful. My mother didn't sugarcoat things. She responded, "Emily, you had everything most women want, and you threw it away. I'm not even sure who you are anymore." That hurts. But she wasn't mistaken. I've had a lot of time to reflect on where I went wrong. It's not simply the cheating or cruel remarks I made. It's how I let my fears get in the way of anything genuine. I was so preoccupied with what other people thought and desiring a perfect life that appeared good on the outside, that I completely disregarded the fact that I had a solid, loving relationship with someone who genuinely cared about me. People are now whispering about me. Even my buddies have withdrawn themselves. Jenna stated that her husband did not want her hanging out with me because I am a bad influence. It stung harder than I thought. But again, I cannot blame him. I have become the cautionary story. People point to someone and say, "Don't end up like her." I'm not sure if I will ever forgive myself for what I did, but I'm trying to move on. If nothing else, I hope someone listens to my experience and learns from it. Do not take for granted the fact that you have someone who loves you for who you are. You might not get another chance. Looking back, I realize I have lost Luke for good. This cannot be fixed. There is no going back to the way things were. And to be honest, I've accepted that I had something extremely uncommon and expensive for a man who loved me completely. And I let it slide through my fingers due to my own anxieties and superficial concerns. If I could go back and undo everything, I would. But that's not how life works. Right. I have spent a lot of time reflecting on things. At first, I wanted to blame the situation, the pressure from friends, or even Luke's lack of progress. But the truth is, I have only myself to blame. He was all I could have asked for. But instead of recognizing that, I let my own self-doubt and vanity to poison our connection. I can't undo the past, but I can admit to it. I hope my experience can help someone out there, anyone who might be in the same position as I was. If you have someone who loves you for who you are, don't let your anxieties ruin things. You might not get another chance. Trust me, the grass seems greener on the other side, and striving for an ideal image of perfection is the quickest way to lose something genuine. If you ever hear this, Luke, LeConte sighed. Luke, I apologize. I know it doesn't solve anything, but I have to say it. You deserved more than what I gave you, and I hope you've discovered it. Now I hope she treats you as I should have. Also, to everyone listening, thank you for sticking around to listen to my tale. Be kind in your comments. Or don't. I probably deserve whatever you're saying. This is not one of those stories in which the narrator receives a happy ending or atonement. It's just reality. And sometimes reality is messy and hard. But it's and I'm learning to deal with it. That's it for me.